Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of r/ProRevenge. In today's episode, I really want to help you not get kicked out of the program I just tried to get you kicked out of. Office thermostat must be left at 16°C? Pep Squad isn't that important, Joni. Before we get started, make sure to subscribe so you will never miss a video. So let's get started. I really want to help you not get kicked out of the program I just tried to get you kicked out of. This all happened about 8 years ago. I was a firefighter going through a paramedic program which was sponsored and more or less run by my fire department. Our program coordinator, PC, was a salty veteran of the department, who also happened to be a salty Marine vet as well, as she would often remind us. Our class was her first opportunity to step up as PC after having been an instructor for the program for years, and she was going to make sure that we didn't embarrass her or make her look bad. Turns out, she didn't need much help with that. For some perspective, paramedic courses are typically a 2-year associate's degree, with plenty of time/separation between coursework, labs and in-field clinical experience. Our program was accelerated with a total time of 6 months, including classes, labs, clinicals and field time, start to finish. Needless to say, the stress associated with successfully completing the program was already through the roof, before accounting for any friction from instructors/PCs. To relieve the stress, we set up what we affectionately referred to as our hobo camp in the back parking lot of the program building. It was not part of the main college campus. This included my broken-down VW Westie, which stored a few chairs, a coffee table, and a few tarps we would string together off the side of the VW for shade. The 21 of us in my program took every opportunity to be outside in the parking lot instead of in the classroom, and got good at playing horse on a balance board, pulling jesters and stalls with a hacky sack, holding jam sessions on a few guitars, and all around kicking back and trying to forget where we were in 10-minute increments during class breaks. 2 of the ringleaders of our hobo group, brothers, happen to be 2 of the JHs mentioned below. They are both awesome guys, real good people, but due to their default and automatic attitudes of malicious compliance, they quickly became thorns in the side of the program's administration, and the anti-heroes of our class. I'm honored to have come out of our medic program alongside the 2 of them, and through this experience to have learned a thing or two from them about malicious compliance. Over the course of the 6 months our program ran, our class had a number of encounters with our former Drill SGT program coordinator, and the inane rules she would set for our class, above and beyond what the program itself dictated. Our first dust-up with our PC was over an attendance form. Every morning, we had to mark our initials next to our names. Simple enough, although we did have 3 classmates with the same initials, JH. After a couple of weeks, one of the JHs began circling his initials, not one of the brothers mentioned above, just to make it stand out from the other 2. Wanting to help him along in his endeavors, a few of us started adding circles, then stars, and then explosions, unicorns and campaign slogans, touting JH for president of the universe. It was a good way to start the day, as we all liked to see what had been added from the day before. This went out for about 2 weeks, when our PC stormed into the room at the beginning of class one day. She whipped out the attendance form, and spent about an hour lecturing us on our lack of professionalism, and about how embarrassed she was to have to submit this form to the state with all the doodles all over it. She then lamented the waste of time that was occurring for the entire class, all because somebody decided to be unprofessional, and then had us all reinitial our names on a fresh form, which took all of 5 minutes, without the lecture. This was the first time we had heard anything about it being considered an official document, but even so, we would have understood and been more than happy to just get a new sheet re-signed, no lecture necessary. With that completed, and still on the war path, our PC then announced that anyone who had contributed to the anarchy displayed on the form would need to get up immediately and follow her into her office. She then marched out. Well, almost half the class had added one thing or another, so we all stood up and followed her into her little closet of an office, having to huddle in so we could all fit. She was visibly surprised that most of us were in there. We highly suspect she had anticipated that the 2 JH brothers, and maybe 1 to 2 others would have been all that she nabbed in her enforcement operation, but went ahead with her course of action for all offending parties involved. She had written up a discipline form for the incident, and had to make copies for everyone in the room, but graciously said that after we had each signed our own copy, she would simply put it in our student records, and it would not be forwarded to the college dean over our particular program, or to our fire department chief, unless we violated any program rules, or the personal code of conduct she had implemented in place of actually following the program rules. She also noted that even though she wasn't forwarding it through the typical channels, this would serve as a first violation of our student agreement, and any other infractions would be considered a second violation. We would be subject to a disciplinary hearing and possible expulsion from the program. We all realized that this would look ridiculous on the desk of the dean or our chief anyway, so gladly accepted the terms of the agreement and went on about our business. Time passed, and while we didn't actively try to antagonize our PC or any other instructors, we honestly didn't have any time/energy for it with the heavy course load we were trying to keep up with. Our PC had set an obvious tone for the remainder of the course. There were multiple small dust-ups over all sorts of things, from what we had to wear in class. Every class before us was allowed to wear civvies in class and be comfortable, but we had to wear Class B uniforms the entire program. To the hobo camp in the parking lot. It turns out the parking lot was privately owned, and that the management company didn't have a single issue with what we were doing, since the parking we used was essentially on the back side of an alley, and not visible to the public whatsoever, and not used for any other businesses or buildings. To writing things on the whiteboard in our classrooms. The whiteboard issue is what led to my final showdown with our PC. The policy of not writing on the whiteboards was one that was only told to one of our breakout groups. Our class would break into 4 smaller groups on certain days and rotate through instructors to allow us more one-on-one time to practice skills such as 4 starts or ET intubations. The group mentioned above had done one thing or another to annoy that particular instructor, and he had mentioned it to our PC, that he had asked them, specifically them, the one group, to refrain from writing on the whiteboards. That particular day, a Friday, my group had finished our rotation in the main classroom, and an excellent discussion with our current instructor had jogged my memory about an interesting quote, which I then decided to write on the top corner of the front whiteboard so others could read and enjoy it. We joined back up as a class at the end of that day, and one of our instructors sent us home for the weekend. The showdown began the following Monday. We were all sitting in class, waiting for the day to start, when our PC stormed into the classroom and demanded that whoever wrote that quote on the whiteboard follow her immediately. Well, knowing for some reason or another I had pissed off the mega beast, I got up and followed her out and into her office. She saw that it was me and expressed surprise that I would have been the one to have done that. She as much as said she had expected one of the JH brothers to have been the culprit, but that regardless, she had already initiated the discipline process. She told me that it was such a serious issue because over the weekend, the dean of the program, as well as a few other administrative types had come for a tour of the facilities and an update on the progress of changes the program was currently making. She had brought them into the classroom as part of the tour and had noticed the quote up on the board. She never hinted as to whether the dean/admin staff had reacted in any way to, or even seen the quote, but the fact that it was up there was embarrassing enough for her as the PC. Along with the fact that the class was told not to write things on the board, she had no choice but to write up a disciplinary form, and since I had a previous infraction on my record, she would obviously have to hold a disciplinary hearing, and reminded me that I might be expelled from the program. She sent me back to class, but pulled me out a few more times throughout the day to first ask me why I had written that quote. I told her I thought the quote was fitting for a conversation my group had just had with our instructor, and why I had written on the board at all. At this point, I was done with the insanity and really didn't care if I got the boot or not, but I told her that this was the first time I had heard that I wasn't supposed to write on the board. She continued with the process and conferred with the instructor, who had asked their group to not write on the board. The instructor said they had told the entire class, not just an individual group. With the instructor having told the PC that, I went along with it, and just told her that if they had told all of us that I simply hadn't heard it, but understood that it was a rule whether it was posted/written anywhere or not, which it wasn't. The discipline process carried on for about 2 weeks, with the PC initially reminding me frequently that I might be getting kicked out of the program. Eventually, I think she started getting some pushback from her supervisors and our chief, as booting me this far into the program would be a huge waste of department resources. We got paid to attend class and the department paid to cover our shifts while in class, so we didn't have to work on shift while attending the program. I was still focusing on class, but it all but checked out as far as the discipline process was concerned. I couldn't see how or why she was so upset, but if she wanted me out, then I'd be happy to be out. I did notice that by the end of the 2 weeks the PC's tone had changed dramatically. Initially she had all but called for my head. But that changed first to "we'll see what we can do to give you another chance to I'm working really hard to keep you here." I think it started changing when the dean and fire chief finally got their hands on the PC's discipline reports, first for making some doodles on an attendance sheet, and then for writing a quote on a board. She evidently hadn't made a note as to what the quote was, and finally asked me if I might remember it, and if I could possibly write it down and explain why I thought it was a good idea to write it on the board, even after I had a first rules violation on the books, and must have known that writing on the whiteboard was a violation that could get me expelled from the program. I remembered the quote all right, and was happy to provide it as well as an explanation. The quote: "We used to think we knew, but now we must confess, the more we know the less." Essentially, my instructor had been talking about how even as a salty medic of 20 years, they were still having to learn new things and re-evaluate their skills/knowledge. I thought that quote was quite fitting. I basically explained it to my PC in writing as saying that even though we think we know everything, we still have a lot to learn. To this day, I honestly think she had taken the quote as an insult to either herself or the program. If only she had known what she had known she'd known. After my explanation had reached the Dean-in-Chief, the disciplinary process was magically concluded, and both incidents were removed from my record. I would have to confirm, but I believe that my class was the only one our program coordinator was allowed to run, and she was asked to go back to instructing after that. Some of the best memories and friendships I made were in the hobo camp, and to this day I know the less. Office thermostat must be left at 16°C? My boss was brought up in a household where the solution to being cold was putting another jumper on, to the extent the inside of the windows used to freeze. Lord knows how many times I have heard that story. Unfortunately, instead of reveling in the marvel that is central heating, my boss feels it necessary to impose the same draconian rules straight from the 18th century on all of us in the office. In a word, it gets damn cold at work. For context, I work in a converted barn which is both poorly insulated and has a tall vaulted roof. This means any heat dissipates upwards, and the building generally needs a lot of heat to stay comfortable. It is not uncommon to be sat indoors wearing my small down jacket and thermal base layers to keep warm. If I was working outside I could accept this, but in an office environment it's unnecessary. To make matters worse, I suffer from Raynaud's, which has been getting worse for the last few years. My condition makes it really rather miserable to sit at work for 8 hours with numb fingers and toes, all because of the lack of proper heating in the middle of winter. I am a long-standing employee, but in all my time working for my company there has always been another colleague with a far more vocal opinion on how warm the office should be. For the last few years, for instance, a colleague of mine would make a big parade about cranking the heating up to 24°C multiple times a day. This resulted in a daily tit-for-tat between my colleague and boss. Typically my boss would see the thermostat, exclaim it's too hot, and switch the boiler off at the mains. No heat. I tried in vain to convince my colleague to leave the heating at a reasonable level, say 19°-20°C, as I was certain my boss was unable to actually tell the heating was set higher than his preferred 15°C unless he could visually see the stat set higher. I was ignored, the tit-for-tat continued, and so did the cold. Roll forward a few years, I am now the only person left in the office other than my boss, his son, and an administrator who works part-time. The temperature has started to drop and the cold has been drawing in. The heating was switched on Monday this week, and like clockwork set bang on 15°C. I decided enough was enough and sat down with my boss to discuss the heating. I explained how cold temperatures affects my Raynaud's and asked if he would be willing to increase the thermostat. Surprisingly, my boss was pretty compassionate and promised to increase the heating starting the very next day. True to his word, my boss did increase the thermostat. By 1 fucking degree. Apparently 16°C was his limit. To say I was livid was an understatement. But more disheartening was looking towards another winter shivering at my keyboard. I couldn't stand the thought, so I decided to take matters into my own hands. 2 really important bits of information popped into my head that morning that formed the perfect plot in an instant. The thermostat was old school, analog, not digital. My boss and his son were out at a meeting for the whole afternoon, and the admin wasn't doing it all. Roll on lunchtime, I took it upon myself to research the model of thermostat. I found an archived manual online, page 3, calibration. I couldn't believe how simple it was to adjust the unit. There was one screw to remove the outer casing which exposed the dial. The dial then simply lifts off the spindle and is rotated and reinserted onto the spindle to calibrate the unit. Armed with my Swiss Army knife, once I was alone in the office I got to work. Disassembling the unit, I rotated the spindle clockwise by 4 degrees, so now when set at 16°C the thermostat would actually measure 20°C. I replaced the casing, and using a relative humidity meter we use for work I tested the switching point of the stat. The office measured at 16.2 C and the stat clicked on around 12 C. Hearing the boiler fire in the kitchen gave me the biggest grin I have had in ages. That was on Tuesday. The remainder of the week has been glorious. For the first time in 8 years the office is actually at a constant, comfortable temperature. I had been waiting to post this in line with the rules as no fallout had occurred. However, this afternoon my boss asked if I was warm enough, again unusually compassionate. While I felt kind of bad to go behind his back, it does give me scope to increase the heating even more when it starts getting really cold in the next few months. I was also pretty ecstatic as it proved the hunch I have had for years: my boss has no idea if the heating is set warmer, other than the number shown on the stat. So an all-out win for my bit of malicious compliance. Pep Squad isn't that important, Joni. Sorry to disappoint, this won't be super intense or great enough to make y'all laugh real hard, but it's a story that I just remembered. Also, I'm on mobile, sorry. So I grew up in a small Baptist town in Texas. If you'll know anything about the South and small towns, you'll know that if you live in a town of under 1,000, your life will be filled with Christianity and sports. I wasn't too much of a Christian, but I did play as many sports as possible. I also was the only person in my class that cared about college. I had the opportunity to enroll in a dual-credit college class as a 12th grader. I took it. During this year, I was playing basketball, which meant at least 4 hours of practice daily, taking at least one college class, doing all my normal classes, and I also did Pep Squad. If you don't know what Pep Squad is, it's basically cheerleading for people that didn't want the uniforms or to do the actual cheers in front of everyone. We sat in the stands during the football games and cheered along, and we helped make signs and did so much for the football team. They did basically nothing for us in basketball, which seemed to only piss me off. So I had a college assignment due late one night that I hadn't had a chance to even start. I asked my Pep Squad proctor, Joni, named changed. She was a really uppity holier-than-thou Baptist. Her and her entire family, including her daughter in my class, are like that. If I could skip the meeting, since it was just us making some candy favors. She told me to my face it wouldn't be fair to the other girls if you get to miss out for an assignment while they're here working hard. I had one. Never missed a meeting before too. Kept my entire class afloat grades-wise since we were literally in primary school, because I didn't care if they cheated off me in 3. Knew that she knew how important my college classes were. I also knew that if it had been her daughter she would have raised hell about it. Joni ended up telling me that I had to make a decision, either focus on my classes, or focus on Pep Squad. I told her cool, I'm done then. And walked out. She summoned me to her room 2 weeks later and berated me for not telling her in a respectful way that I was quitting. I reminded her of her stupid ultimatum that she gave me, and told her she was lucky I didn't tell either of my parents, seeing as my dad had worked at my school for literal decades and had a temper, and my mom would not hesitate in taking her out for that. They also wanted me to take my classes seriously, so they definitely would have torn her ass apart. She backed off and I passed that class with an A. After that, seeing as I was the loudest and stayed on beat with the drum, also had the only brain, somehow the Pep Squad sucked. If you made it to the end of the video, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe and share, and we will see you in the next video.